Welcome to part 9 of the English settlement of the New World. Now we're going to look at the myth of religious toleration. There's a common belief out there that the United States was founded on the ideas of religious toleration. But it's important that we really take a look at this, because when we really examine this, we see that that's really not the case at all, right? Now, first of all, when we take a look at some of these colonies, we need to realize that a lot of these colonies were not formed with any religion in mind whatsoever. I mean, take a look at, for example, New York and New Jersey, right? Those were gifts from Charles II to James. Virginia was a business proposition. Georgia is a military buffer zone, right? Religion's not a consideration here, right? And as a matter of fact, the idea of religious toleration at that time was not even considered a virtue, right? The desire to escape religious persecution did not lead you to tolerate other beliefs. As a matter of fact, if anything, just the opposite. Take a look at some of the examples we've already talked about. The Puritans created their model Christian society there, that city upon a hill in Boston. Do you think that model Christian society was welcoming to other religious ideas? Certainly not. I mean, we saw the results of that. Roger Williams and Anne Hutchinson both being banished for being dissenters, right? They're both exiled, right? If you are exiled and you return, the penalty for returning is death, right? Take a look at Maryland, right? Maryland creates an act that they call an act of religious toleration in 1649, but it only protected Trinitarian Christians. In other words, Protestants and Catholics. So even if you were Orthodox Christian, you couldn't live in Maryland. And again, if you were caught living there, the penalty was death. There's no religious toleration here in that. And it's not too surprising. This is groups of people that are formed and they have a long history of religious intolerance, right? Wars were fought over this. For example, Christians versus Muslims in the Crusades. Protestants versus Catholics in the 30 Years' War. Right? Protestants versus Protestants in that English Civil War that we already talked about, right? Okay. So where does this idea come from? Where is this idea that we're a nation built on toleration? How do we trace it all the way back to these colonies? You know, I mean, do we look back to Roger Williams' idea of religious freedom in Rhode Island? Well, again, we already talked about that. It wasn't really religious freedom he was talking about. It was the separation of church and state, and specifically, it was to keep the government out of the church, right? He said that governments stink in the nostrils of God, right? And that he had to maintain the purity of the church against the corruption of the state. Okay, not the way we think about it now. Is it perhaps the First Amendment? A lot of people point to that. Well, remember, the First Amendment says freedom of religion. Sure, it certainly does say that, but we need to take a look at that for what it was when they wrote it. Freedom of religion didn't just mean that you were going to be accepting of every religion out there. What it meant when they wrote that is that there would be no state religion, no federal government. There would be no Church of the United States, like there is a Church of England, right? That didn't keep the states, the individual states, from having their own official religions. For example, Congregationalism was the official religion of Massachusetts until 1833, well after the ratification of the Bill of Rights and that First Amendment, right? We got to take a look at it for what it is, okay? And remember, too, toleration does not translate into acceptance. Even the word itself, we tend to think of toleration today as acceptance, but it's not the origins of that word. Toleration is from the word tolerare, the Latin word, which means I suffer you to exist, right? That just means that, yes, you're here and I won't kill you for being you, right? That's not exactly what we think now when we think of toleration, right? Now, afterwards, as we move forward in time, we still see several examples of intoleration of religious beliefs, right? For example, Catholicism, which is a Christian religion. And though it is widely accepted, think about it for a second. How many Catholic presidents have we had? We've had one, right? We've had others that ran, and an argument was made often when they ran. So, well, if he becomes president, he will take orders from the Pope, right? And so the Pope will run the United States, not the president. John F. Kennedy, who was the only Catholic president, actually had to campaign and say in several speeches, I will not be taking orders from the Pope. Or how about this example? When we talk about anti-Semitism, well, that was very prevalent in the United States, just like it was in Germany during World War II. For example, a book published in the United States in 1920 was titled The International Jew, the World's Foremost Problem. And here's a quote from that book. It says, the immigration problem is Jewish. The money question is Jewish. The tie-up of world politics is Jewish. The term of the peace treaty, the Treaty of Versailles, are Jewish. The diplomacy of the world is Jewish. The moral question of movies and theaters is Jewish. The mystery of the illicit liquor business, remember this during Prohibition, is Jewish, right? Who wrote this book? The founder of Ford Motor Company, Henry Ford, wrote this book, right? So where do we get this idea of religious toleration from, right? That is a founding principle. Well, really we can trace it to World War II and what happened to the Jews in that war, right? Adolf Hitler and the creation of state-sanctioned extermination of a group based solely on their religious affiliation made the idea of religious intoleration unacceptable, right? It gave it a bad name. Defeating him required the efforts of 15 million Americans in uniform, and that's just the American contribution. It's just a drop in the bucket compared to the rest of the world, right? Okay. This is going to make the idea of showing any signs of religious intolerance absolutely verboten. And so as a result of that, we have built this image of always being a nation of religious toleration ever since, right? The reality is a little different, but at least look at it this way. The ultimate outcome has been positive. Sure, we may not have actually started out as a nation based on religious toleration, but we certainly have moved towards being a nation of religious toleration, and hopefully, because we're still not perfect, hopefully we'll keep moving towards more and more towards that each and every day.